This is the future of Africa. In this program, we focus on Horn of Africa's political, economic, and socio-cultural aspects. Let's share our vision, hopes, and professional critics. All views are esteemed. Stay with us. Professor Lumumba, welcome to this program.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
It's an honor to have you here, and Professor Lumumba is an author, lawyer, and human rights advocate, and he is a well-known, world-class, inspirational speaker. And he was the founder and chairman of the PLO Lumumba Foundation. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let's start our discussion. I recognize that you have a great dream for Africa, and you have been teaching and speaking loudly and boldly about it. From the point of your splendid dream, if you like, for Africa, how do you see the current position of the continent in terms of politics, in terms of economy, and perhaps on relation to its current stand of the continent in the world stage?
The dream that I have about Africa is a dream that I believe is shared by many. And those of us who appreciate the history of it, it is the dream that the founding fathers had. And if we go back to the 1940s, 1960s, culminating in the foundation of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963, we were very clear that we wanted an Africa that was united, an Africa that would be prosperous, an Africa that would create opportunities for our sons and daughters, an Africa that would have a respected and respectable voice in the world. And there is a sense in which in the early days, those dreams of liberating Africa from the yoke of colonialism was realized. Of course, it was not something that happened easily. We know how the colonialists left. We know how the apartheid regime was ultimately eliminated in 1994. But there is a sense in which Africa has not achieved her dreams. If you look at the critical indices that we ought to look at, if you look at agriculture, if you look at innovation and invention, if you look at African economies, if you look at African politics, we continue to underachieve. And that, to me, is something that ought to worry us. We are easily a population of 1.4 billion, and that, on paper, is a big market which ought to give us the leverage that we have. But the 55 odd African countries only have a gross domestic product of no more than 2 trillion United States dollars. So there are many things that continue to divide us. And this is my worry. Despite regaining political independence, Africa continues to see herself, or individual African countries continues to see themselves as appendages of the former colonizers, the British, the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese, and much more recently we have seen the hand of the United States of America, the hand of China, the hand of Turkey, and all these things ought to worry us. But that notwithstanding, I think that the continent has great potential, but potential in and of itself is like gold unrefined or flowers ungathered. So we must do something else in order to ensure that the African dream is realized sooner rather than later. Easier said than done, but we must work at it.
Thanks so much, Professor. How about, let's put it more how about the future hope? What can we expect from Africa? I think once in Addis, your speech, I quote, Africa in the next 25 years will be recolonized. Do you still believe in that, or do we have really some hope, or do we have some kind of strategy by which Africans will never recolonized again?
You know, when I talked about the possible recolonization of Africa, my meaning was that the architecture of international economic relations and the architecture of African politics or the international politics is of such a nature that we will not go back to classical colonization. Yep. But look at the state of Africa today. We are 55 countries, some say 54. So that there is a danger of thinking about Africa as if she were a homogeneous whole. That is not true. As I speak to you today, there are over 21 conflicts in Africa of one kind or another, of different intensities. In Ethiopia, we know the conflict. In Sudan, in South Sudan, in Central African Republic, in Cameroon, in Ambazonia, in Mali, and in many countries. And one of the things that I think Africa must do is to resolve those conflicts, to look at what a friend of mine calls the social contract. How do we relate with one another within the artificial boundaries that we inherited from the colonizers? How are we going to deal with issues of self-determination? Because we can only realize our economic potential if we have an environment that is conducive. And as long as there are conflicts, as long as people are unhappy with administration, then Africa will always be a breeding ground for discontent. And if Africa has discontent, then that will be exploited. Remember that a disunited, disorganized Africa is a potential environment for manipulation. And we are already beginning to see it. We begin to see a new scramble for Africa. If you look keenly in the recent past, you've seen how aggressive the British are, how aggressive the French are, how aggressive the Chinese are, how aggressive the Russians are, how aggressive the Turks are, because they look at Africa as a place where there are resources, natural and human. And therefore, going forward, in order to immunize ourselves from the possibility of recolonization, and that recolonization, if it happens, will be very subtle, is about control of resources. It is about control of economics. They'll not bother with our politics. They'll allow us to elect our presidents. They'll allow us to engage in political activity, but they will know that they can control the politicians, and once they control the politicians, then they control our resources, and once they control our resources, then they give meaning to the old English saying, "He who pays the piper calls the tune."
Thank you so much. I was to ask you that question. It was the following question for me. Yeah, as you know, quite a number of African countries, there are still daunting challenges, like including what you have said. I would like to see reflection in terms of democracy, in terms of good governance. You see, there is no autonomy, there is no accountability, there is no transparency, sometimes participation, the rule of law and justice. These things are missing, and how do you see these things? Because these are basis for economic development itself.
You know, the great African American thinker and scholar and Pan-Africanist John Henry Clark once said that when African countries regained political independence, all of them did so on the basis of foreign systems which were a mimicry of European governance models. And he said that Africa will never succeed while they continue on the path of mimicry of those models. Today, we talk about democracy. And when you talk about democracy, the tendency is to say is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is a Lincolnian aphorism and definition of what democracy is. And if you talk about democracy in Africa today, the understanding of the politician is about periodic elections.
Sure.
And democracy is a lot more than periodic elections. In my book, democracy is about people participation in governance. Sure. Democracy is about those people being aware of what they are talking about. Democracy is about governance that allows the people to realize their potential in all its facets, economically and otherwise. And there is no one-size-fits-all democracy. So I think that there is a problem in most African countries when we talk about democracy and the involvement of the people. And you've seen in the recent past, in many African countries, immediately after their election, there are conflicts because the politicians are dissatisfied, the populace is dissatisfied, which means that we must now begin to ask ourselves, what is democracy? Does democracy as defined for us by outsiders equate to good governance? Because good governance is what people want. At a very basic level, if you asked an African man or woman in the streets of Bangui in Central African Republic, or in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, or Boya in Ambazonia, what they want is, if there is democracy, we want to participate in determining who is to govern us.
Sure.
And once we have determined who is going to govern us, we want to see whether they will create an environment where we have good education, where we have good agriculture that will allow us to feed ourselves, where we have health facilities, where we have infrastructure, where we have opportunities for our young men and women. And if those are the indices that we want to consider, then I must say that there is a crisis of governance in Africa. See that I'm not using the word democracy. I'm saying there is a crisis of governance in Africa, and we must address that crisis of governance.
Great reflection.
Yes.
As you said, you see, they tend to focus on periodic elections.
Absolutely.
And actually, the type of elections are not usually fair, free, and so on. At the end of the day, I realized from your speech that they tend to be boss, not leaders.
Absolutely.
How do you see that?
You know, your typical African politician is part of our problem, but even the electorate is part of the problem. So that we have individuals who are politicians. I cannot remember who it is that said this, but I think it is right, that the politician thinks about the next election, but the statesman thinks about the next generation. We have too many people who are much more preoccupied with occupation of public office for personal benefit and material aggrandizement to the detriment of the people. The net effect, therefore, is that governance suffers. And I'm suggesting that if Africa is to realize our potential, we must have men and women who see positions of power not as positions of material aggrandizement, but a privilege to serve. And this is what gives meaning to perhaps what has now become a cliche, servant leadership. And what is servant leadership? Servant leadership, from where I sit, is a kind of leadership that obligates a person in authority to do what is in the general good. Unfortunately, most of the individuals we have in public office see themselves as demigods. They see themselves as individuals who ought to be served. They have a sense of entitlement and they don't serve Africa well. And because they are not accountable to the people, their countries cannot realize their potential. And because their countries can't realize their potential, there is discontent. And because there is discontent, development is stunted. And because development is stunted, the countries are susceptible to manipulation. And because the countries are susceptible to manipulation, neocolonialism can thrive. And that is where Africa and African countries largely find themselves.
Excellent. They're supposed to serve the people, but
they don't.
They don't.
They don't.
They tend to get service.
Absolutely.
To be served when they are in power.
Fact, I said that one of the shortest avenues to becoming a multi-billionaire in Africa is to be a politician.
Yep.
Once you become a politician, then you get salaries that are outside of this world. Then you have access to the people's taxes. Then you are available to be corrupted by people from different civilizations. And lo and behold, you become a multi-millionaire reaping where you did not sow.
Great. Let me take you back to the point that you raised minutes ago. Like, there are for about 21 and over a lot of conflicts in Africa, including in Ethiopia. And political leaders tend to solve that through war instead of, you see, peaceful way of discussing and discussion at all. How do you see this?
You know, when people are determined to realize their potential, history has demonstrated not once, not twice, that you can never defeat them by force of arms. And I think the time is now when African politicians must be brave enough to resolve the problems that undermine African unity. Some who don't understand the state of Africa think that self-determination is not possible as one of the ways of bringing about unity. But I believe that the African governance systems must be renegotiated. Say, for example, if there is a conflict in Ethiopia, as we know there is. Recently with Tigray, we know the problems with the Oromo and other parts of Ethiopia. You need an all-Ethiopian meeting to discuss the status and the future of Ethiopia. You need a meeting of all Congolese to discuss the state of the Congolese nation now and for the future. You need the people of Cameroon to discuss the future of Ambazonia. You need Central African Republic to meet. You need Mali, Guinea, Conakry, Mozambique, everywhere where there is conflict. Because if you don't, history has been consistent and history never lies. You and me were alive when the Soviet Union collapsed. You and me were alive when Yugoslavia split into several nations. You and me were alive when the Czech Republic separated from Czechoslovakia. And the message is one and clear. A stitch in time saves nine. We have cancerous problems which cannot be solved through band-aid solutions. Negotiation, and it is through negotiation that all these conflicts will be resolved.
Great. Why do you think they failed to learn from the past?
Yeah, a friend of mine once told me that the only lesson that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. But that is a tragedy. Those who fail to learn from history are those who are myopic. They are those who do not understand that if you don't learn from history, history will judge you harshly. They do so because they are not leaders. You know, we must never confuse individuals who occupy positions of leadership and leaders. Leaders and statesmen and women are individuals who are capable of looking to the future. And when they have looked at the future, then they ask themselves, what stands in the way of the success of a people, and how can that be resolved? Of course, there are people in Africa who have demonstrated in the recent past that they are capable of looking into the future. Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania had the capability to see the future, and that is how we had Tanzania, Tanganyika, and Zanzibar coming together to create Tanzania. Nelson Mandela, to his credit, was capable of seeing the landmines that attended the apartheid regime and made necessary strategic and tactical compromises to create the state that we know is now South Africa. Of course, the current leaders are beginning to undermine that. So it is not that there is a shortage of leaders. Kwame Nkrumah was able to see this in 1963 when he said that we must unite. But the current crop of leaderships want to be big fish in small ponds, and that is the tragedy. And they thrive on dividing, and they believe that divide and rule is the way of sustaining themselves in power. But for how long? Because you may think that you are large, larger than life, almost as large as death. But history has demonstrated that when you are dominated by such myopia, then ultimately you destroy your nation and destroy generations. So my hope and prayer is that conversations and engagements such as these will make some of these individuals to take a step backward and say, let us ask ourselves, is it not better that we discuss these issues and save our nations for this generation and generations yet to be born? That is what must happen.
Wow, that's great. And as you know, the African head of states will be coming to US here. And I don't know the agenda, but what can we expect? Do you expect something new? And do you know why they are coming here?
Brother, I don't expect anything new. As I told you at the very beginning, there is now a scramble for Africa. And the scramble manifests itself in a number of ways. You see, the Chinese come to Africa and they call African leaders to Beijing. The Turks call the same leaders to Istanbul. The Japanese call them to Tokyo. The Europeans called them to Brussels. The English or the British called them to London. The Americans have now summoned them to the United States of America. And it's called an African-American meeting for the mutual benefit of the countries. But let me tell you, the relationship between a weak Africa and a strong America is like the relationship between the horse and the rider. In this case, Africa is the horse and America is the rider. First of all, the Africans will be congregating in Washington, D.C. from the 13th through to the 15th of this month. They are coming, each one of them, the 45 of them, from their different countries. They have no common position. So when you don't have a common position, it means you are susceptible to manipulation. Number two, you will see during that meeting that the President of the United States will have bilateral agreements with them. So you are coming as Africa, but during that very meeting, you'll be divided as Uganda, as Rwanda, as South Africa, as Egypt, as Kenya, as Senegal. And number three, you will discover that America is convening this meeting because America is clear about what it wants. But do African countries know what they want? We are already being told that one of the big issues that is going to happen is that the President of the United States of America is going to recommend that Africa becomes a member of the G20. So when it is in the interest of these countries, then you are lumped together as Africa. And when it is convenient, then you are separated as individual countries. Do I blame the United States of America? No, I don't. Who do I blame? I blame our politicians. Because if you don't define what you want, it will be defined for you. And as Ronald Reagan once said when he was the president of the United States of America, America will always do what is in the best interest of America. So this meeting that we are going to see from the 13th through to the 15th day of December 2022 will largely be in the best interest of the United States of America. If anything does go to Africa, it will be tokenism. It will be something that is meant to humor Africans. It is us who must style up. It is us who must make demands of our politicians. If we don't do so, then, as a friend of mine rightly said, you can't be on the table either as a diner or as food to be consumed. Africa is consistently on the menu rather than as a diner.
Thanks so much. And in your speech in the conference, I was there, you were talking about Africa exporting raw materials and no processing, what have you. And at the end of the day, the products were claimed by Europeans or other countries. My interest always, I'm an educator and I've been in the field of education. And don't you think that education really is affecting what we are doing back home? And how do you see the role of education in general and in Africa in particular?
You know, my brother, education is the mother's milk of all these things. And it's not just education, it is what kind of education. Because you can have education in quotes and quotes, where we certify you as a doctor, we certify you as a lawyer, we certify you as an engineer, we certify you in any discipline, but your contribution to the society is very minimal. We must have education that turns you inside out, because the mind is still the standard of a person. So the education must be of such a nature that if I am a graduate in agriculture, the knowledge that I have acquired is knowledge that is going to ensure that Africa can feed herself. And I say that deliberately because the year 2022 is the designated year for nutrition and agriculture in Africa. But Africa is a net importer of food. If you are an engineer, you must be an engineer that is capable of inventing and innovating so that we are capable of adding value to our products. This is the era of nanotechnology, the Internet of Things. We are merely consumers of the products of invention. Are we inventing? So I can't agree with you more, and it cannot be overemphasized that education is at the very heart of it. And if there was any doubt, you and me, during our lifetime, we have seen a country like China emerge simply because they put premium on education. We have seen Japan emerge simply because of education. We have seen South Korea simply because of education. We have seen Indonesia emerge. We have seen Vietnam, which was at war until 1975. So education, and education is not simply the christening of institutions as universities. No, it is about the content and the quality of instruction and how the quality and that instruction changes men and equips them with the tools that are necessary for the purpose of revolutionizing the lifestyles of the people. In other words, if there is a graduate, as I said at the beginning, in agriculture, his or her presence in the community or the society ought to lead to improved production so that people can feed themselves. If that does not happen, then that education is no better than the clothes that we wear in the morning and remove in the evening.
It's hard time really to stop talking with you, but in the interest of time, we have to stop. And let me give you the final opportunity to say out if you have some concluding remark or remarks in a split of seconds. I would like to see, I mean, your hope, your vision again for Africa. And for more, I would like to get your advice on what's happening in countries like Ethiopia these days.
I believe that the continent of Africa and the peoples of Africa have the ability to lift the continent from the quagmire of underdevelopment onto the firm ground of development understood in all its permutations. But that is not going to happen until we put our house in order. We must resolve the conflicts in Africa. We must improve governance in Africa. We must ensure that we educate our young men and women. We must then ask ourselves what are the areas in which we are going to redefine ourselves. We must feed ourselves. We must improve our technology. We must invent and innovate. We must ensure that we deal with the question of energy, because we are not going to industrialize unless we are capable of using our resources to harness solar power, hydroelectric power, geothermal power, and all these things can only happen if we have a leadership that knows its role and a followership that can hold leadership to account. These are the things that we must do. I'm aware that under Africa Agenda 2063, we have now said that by the year 2063, we are going to ensure that Africa is a leading participant in the affairs of the world. Easier said than done. We must work at it. I'm aware that Africa now recognizes that we must conduct trade amongst ourselves. It pains me when we import fish from China. Yeah. It pains me when we import grain from the United States of America. It pains me when we import chicken and chicken feed from Brazil, and yet we have all these things. It pains me when we are still exporting raw coffee, raw tea, raw cocoa, and then importing the final product. It pains me when I see Africa becoming a dumping ground for clothes that have been worn in Europe and America, while our textile industries are dying. It pains me when our academic staff cannot be paid and they are demotivated. It pains me when we have to seek medical treatment in Europe, in India, and yet we have some of the best trained men and women in the medical field. It is this pain must now be converted into something that will motivate the continent of Africa to move in the right direction. We cannot afford the luxury of despair. We cannot afford the luxury of giving up, and I have no doubt in my mind that it will happen. If not in our lifetime, then we must equip the succeeding generation to carry the baton. There are going to be difficulties, but our strength lies in surmounting those difficulties.
Wow, we conclude our discussion with the great son of Africa, Professor Lumumba. For those of you who have professional vision, critique, and hope, please, the door is open. Professor, profoundly thank you so much. It's an honor for me to discuss with you, to interview, and we have a similar professional background. I was a university professor at Addis Ababa University. It was really great to be with you.
Thank you very much, Prof.
This is the future of Africa. In this program, we focus on Horn of Africa's political, economic, and socio-cultural aspects. Let's share our vision, hopes, and professional critiques. All views are esteemed. Stay with us.